This episode of the Museum JEDI show is brought to you by Monadnock Media. Monadnock is a media design and production company that collaborates with museums to create media experiences that explore and celebrate racial equity and social justice. To learn more, visit monadnock.org. This episode is also brought to you by the American Association for State and Local Histories, Reframing History, a national member organization that connects people to each other and to resources that help the history community thrive. AASLH has just released the Reframing History Toolkit, which provides new evidence-backed strategies to communicate about history more convincingly and to help your audience understand what inclusive history is and why it matters for all of us. Download it for free at aaslh.org. If you would like to individually give to the Museum JEDI show, please send your support to either one of the following mobile payment services: Cash App, $, capital T, lowercase HE, capital M, lowercase USEUM, capital J, capital E, capital D, capital I. Spells out the Museum JEDI. Also, you can give on PayPal through paypal.me/capital T, lowercase h, lowercase e, capital M, lowercase u, lowercase s, e, u, and m, and then capital JEDI. PayPal.me/the Museum JEDI. Welcome everyone to the Museum JEDI show. JEDI stands for Justice, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion. This show meets at the intersection of museums and social justice. So today we are super excited because we're going to talk about this new book called The Inclusive Museum Leader that was co-edited by my friends Cinnamon Catlin-Legutko and Dr. Chris Taylor. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to read you their bios, and then we're going to get this thing started here in one moment. So Cinnamon's bio is she's been working in museums for more than 20 years. She believes that they have the power to change lives, inspire movements, and challenge authority. She's been a museum director since 2001, and she's been a frequent presenter at national meetings and is often asked to comment on national museum issues. As the president and CEO of the Abbey Museum from 2009 to 2019, she was the motivational leader behind the museum's decolonization initiative, working with the Native communities in Maine to develop policies and protocols to ensure collaboration and cooperation with the Wabanaki people. Prior to joining the Abbey in 2009, Cinnamon was a director of the General Lew Wallace Study and Museum in Crawfordsville, Indiana, where she led the organization to the National Medal for Museum Service in 2008. In 2019, she became the director of the Illinois State Museum. She holds a BA in anthropology and art history from Purdue University, and she is a graduate of the University of Arkansas Fayetteville in the MA program in anthropology with a specialization in museum studies. In 2016, Cinnamon gave her first TEDx talk, "We Must Decolonize Our Museums," and she's been featured on the Museopunks podcast series. She's the author of Administration 2.0, The Art of Healing, the Wishart Art Collection in 2004, and co-editor of the Small Museum Toolkit that was released in 2012. So I'd like to welcome Cinnamon Catlin-Legutko. And Cinnamon, I think we met back in 2016 at Mass Action. I believe it was the first time we met over there in Minnesota in Chris's stomping grounds. And
I think that was.
It's been a pleasure to get to know you and build with you, my sister.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm going to go ahead and introduce Chris. Chris Taylor spent 15 years working in museums, primarily at the Minnesota Historical Society. He began his career as an educator, but quickly saw the power that history can have on an individual's identity. Definitely can relate to that. Through the stories they elevate or suppress, museums have the power to either fortify or disrupt the status quo, but Chris came to understand that this must be an intentional choice. He began teaching undergraduate courses at the University of Minnesota on diversity in the museum field. as part of the Museum Fellowship designed to increase the diversity of museum professionals. At the Minnesota Historical Society, he successfully created the Department of Inclusion and Community Engagement to steward the museum's systemic efforts for inclusion and equity. He also became the very first Chief Inclusion Officer in the museum field, a position that he occupied for 4 years. Museums around the country sought out Chris as a consultant for their inclusion and equity efforts. In 2019, he was recruited to become the Chief Inclusion Officer for the state of Minnesota, one of only 2 states to have this position. There he leads the development and implementation of a statewide strategy for inclusion and equity across more than 20 state agencies. He has authored numerous articles, including 2 chapters of the Mass Action Toolkit, and in 2021, he successfully defended his dissertation. And I want Chris, what was the dissertation title again?
It was how museum professionals of color experience the ideology of white normativity in their museum work.
Now that sounds pretty deep. I'm going to just leave that right there. And I'm so glad, that we're able to make this time and be together on this call. And what I want to do a little bit here is read a quick excerpt that I believe was at the beginning of the book, because I believe it beautifully set the tone for what you all created here. And it says, museums have been hurtling toward this difficult year for decades now. Leading into this infamous year of 2020, the structure and nature of museums and museum work were under the microscope. Academics, anti-racist practitioners, and decolonizers were pushing leadership to upend the status quo and make radical change. We can see that in relation to the sea change that museums need to experience, leaders were only offering minuscule droplets of change in the face of a boiling workforce and constituency. This certainly influenced our interest in joining forces to work on a book like this, but we felt urgently compelled to write and edit this book after George Floyd was murdered on camera by a Minneapolis police officer on May 25th, 2020. So what I would like for you all to talk about, and allow Cinnamon to go first, talk to us about that punch in the gut moment that you felt when you witnessed and saw that video for the first time, and how it motivated you to put this idea together.
Oh, yes, I think it's a moment many of us won't forget. I remember being so mired in a response with my organization to work from home during COVID. I was a new museum director at the Illinois State Museum. I had just been on board for 6 months before we all had to go home. There weren't many protocols in place. I already felt incredibly unsafe. And then George Floyd was murdered, and I realized I have to do something. We all have to do something. I don't know what I can do, but what I've been worrying about to this point is so modest in comparison to the rage that I was feeling. And then connecting with colleagues, especially. And I will say that the being at home allowed for interesting connections with colleagues you would never normally have. During that period of time, I was meeting with a group of women who work in museums every Friday to process what we were experiencing. So I immediately had people to start talking with in ways I never had before. And so many of us didn't even know what to do with our feelings. But many of us knew to protest. And I was not raised as someone who took to the streets. It just wasn't something our family did. But yet I was super conscious, aware, connected wherever possible. And I still didn't know that taking to the streets was the thing I needed to do, because I was so focused on museum and where my staff were. It was just it's hard to even describe it. It was so confusing. But I sat with it for the month of June. And by the end of June, I knew what I had to do. And I thought, I have the opportunity to make a book happen. I'm so disappointed again and again by my museum colleagues who are leaders, because we're starting to see performative statements around that time. We're seeing really empty promises around change in museums and what they can do. And I sat with it, and And the first name that came to me was Chris Taylor, that I want to do something with Chris for so many reasons, but primarily because he's in the Twin Cities. He's experiencing this on the ground. He's working for the state of Minnesota. I know his work deep and wide because he worked with us at the Abbey Museum, as well as through opportunities through Mass Action. I got to know Chris. And it was when he said yes, I knew there was possibility. And I felt like that horror, that frustration, that confusion could be turned into something that I had the potential to be part of. So that's a really long answer to that moment. I clearly haven't fully processed all of it yet, as many haven't. But that's what that month felt like.
Well, that's an incredible testimony. I mean, everybody was just so, caught up in these moments, and it felt like our industry, our sector was going through sort of a come to Jesus moment with a lot of different things that they've been grappling with. And so this is really helpful for us to understand how this book came together, because there's just such incredible work in there. Chris, how was it for you?
I think for me, when George Floyd was murdered, it really blew the cap off of a lot of things that had been brewing here for a while, right? Minnesota is often ranked as one of the best places or the best states to live in the country, unless you're Black. Then it usually winds up being somewhere in the bottom 4. And so we've had issues, and that's consistent. And the last poll I saw, I want to say, was 2019 and 2020. So, I mean, it hasn't changed. And, I think for me, we had seen Philando Castile killed by cops in 2016. Prior to that, we had seen Jamar Clark killed by cops. And those are the names that we know of, right? And I think we know that there are plenty of folks that either lose their life or are harmed physically by cops every day, right? And so I think for me, seeing that happen and seeing the reaction of enough is enough, right? We're not gonna just be here and hold vigils anymore, but we are going to let you know that we've had enough. How much can a people or a community take, right? And I think seeing that, much like Cinnamon, I've never been someone who has been out marching or these types of things. But I think, thinking about my role in the state and what we can do to make change. But I also think about museums and the power of museums to create narratives. The role that museums have played in creating the current narrative, which elevates whiteness to a place of supremacy, right? But also this disconnect in my museum community of all these phenomenal people that were doing incredible things that weren't performative, right? And these were folks that maybe they had leadership roles, but maybe they didn't, right? And so when Cinnamon had reached out and said, hey, this book has to happen and I want you to write the book, I was still working on my dissertation and all these things, but it wasn't a question, right? It wasn't a question, it was yes. The conversation I had with my wife was a little dicey, but it was a yes right out of the bat, right? Right off the bat. So, but I think our early conversations were, it's not about us. We have the platform or the venue. It's about getting the voices of all these people that are doing amazing work, who are showing the type of leadership that will create more just organizations, that will create more inclusive organizations, that will really fulfill that potential of the social impact that museums can have as change agents. Those were the people that needed to be showcased in the book. And so it was an honor to be a part of the project, and people like you and people like Lisa Lee and people like Ashley Rogers and just the incredible people who are featured in that book. As the chapters were coming in, it was almost like such an honor to be able to read those before anybody else. So yeah, I think for me it was a no-brainer. It was my way that I could protest, and I could feel like I was doing something that was within my comfort zone and within my identity that could contribute to all of the other work that was happening as we were seeing this kind of racial reckoning happening in 2020.
Oh man, I mean, both of you are giving me life with that, because I think it is really good to call out the fact that scholarship and thought leadership is a form of activism. It is a form of rebuke of oppressive power structures. I just think about all the times where we're thinking about activism, we're always thinking about someone who's hitting the streets with the signs and all the things that we've seen over the last year and a half in particular, but obviously for decades before that. But really to see how you brought in this group together and the way that you structured it, which is really what I want to get into next, was incredible. So for both of you, I want you to talk about the structure, because I'll be honest, when I first saw like the long list of authors, I was like, wow, like this is kind of a lot. Like, what's going on here? But then when I saw it in the book and I saw how it was structured, you got 28 chapters organized like in 6 parts with these sub themes, and like basically 32 contributors, because you have some chapters with multiple contributors. I'm just, and then what you did, which I thought was wonderful, was at the end of each part, you put like an activity at the end. So now you're allowing people to make meaning of what they read and to really immerse themselves in doing the work, which I think was a common thread throughout all of the chapters. So I don't know who wants to start, but what led to those type of curatorial or editorial decisions?
I would like to start because first off, I want to give Cinnamon like 99.5% of the credit for the structure, because like she really saw the vision. But what we did, we talked about it early on, and what we said was we want to provide a container for folks to write within, right? So we wanted to give some guidelines without giving boundaries, if that makes sense. And
Yeah.
I think that what we came up with was a series of 5 prompts, and I don't have the prompts in front of me, but it was essentially like, you know, one of them I think had something to do with talk about your catalyzing moment when you realized you were becoming an inclusive leader, or another one talked about, you know, leadership in the face of this kind of COVID dual pandemic. I love how you wrote it in the book, the 16 COVID 16-19, right? And all of these things that were kind of coalescing together. And so we gave the prompts and we sent out emails. And we didn't hear a lot of no's. We really didn't, which was phenomenal. And I think as we started to see people say, hey, I want to write on this, or hey, I think I can hit all 5 of these, or, you know, these types of things, we started to see kind of a natural organization happening. But I think, like I said, I really give credit to Cinnamon, because she was really adept at like picking up on different threads and really putting the chapters together. So I'd love to hear her speak on this question a little bit. And then the activities, I mean, we can address that afterwards. That was you know, one of those things where it's just like, just let us write. Like, what do we need activities for? And then it's like, because that's the practical stuff. That's where the change happens, right? So putting in the activities, and we borrowed some, we created some, but you know, it was really, really something where we thought, how does this go beyond attempts that we've seen elsewhere to really be something where if somebody is saying, I really want to change how I do this, help me have some tools or some practical things, that those would be in there. But yeah, Cinnamon, I'd love to hear your thoughts on the organization, because I really feel like you brought that to life.
Well, you are generous in your compliments, because I certainly didn't noodle over it all by myself. The prompt idea I thought was brilliant, just casting out this wide list. And I had moments where I thought, oh my gosh, we're going to get essays that come in, they're all the same, which was very foolish, actually, because we asked the activist-minded museum professionals, the people at different rungs of museum leadership. We were really careful to make sure it wasn't all top leadership. We wanted to make sure it was people leading from the middle. We wanted to make sure we had international voices in the mix. So we were really careful with that dynamic, and then shut out these same prompts, and then folks picked which one resonated. And what was so brilliant was, in the process, we had a really serious commitment to our timeline. Books and publications can slide on their timelines a lot. There was not an option for this one to slide. To be frank, and I haven't had a chance to tell a lot of people this, we received our contract to write this, I want to say in August of last year, and we delivered the manuscript in the first week of December. So we weren't messing around. We weren't playing. And people had to be with us on that. And fortunately, just like Chris said, there weren't a lot of no's. It was simply people who couldn't make it happen because of various other things that they had to do, right? Because we were all living in a pretty serious time of crisis, the back half of last year. But fortunately, because of that rigid timeline structure, it made people show up in different ways. Right? So I have enough time, I can write this short of an essay, or I have all the time I need to write a longer essay, or I can't write an essay, but I would love to talk to you. So we were able to do these interviews, which was a really slick adaptation on our part, but in fact, it was necessary to hear that direct communication and give texture to it. We could have had all of these essays and really missed that opportunity to bring first person voice forward that way. So that dynamic was a happenstance based on timeline, I would say, while the activities were always going to be there for all the things said. The practical is the core of this. The personal work is the core of this. But I will say, when we sat down and looked at all of the things that were written, how they fell into the parts, as you described, there's 6 sections. That was some magic. It was a magic trick to figure out how that could happen. But we know that there's a learning process for each of us. And some of us need the stage set. Some of us need to have hard-hitting language, so that second part, changes required, does that. Some of us just need to see examples and start to emulate. And you can skip right to part 3 and talk about inclusive leadership. And from that point, really began to make decisions around value and action and who you're going to work with and what you're going to do, and still have room to think about the future, because the work is never done. So I would say in many ways that the sections of the book coalesced around how we hope people move through their journey, right? It's never over. There's ways to double back, start again, rethink it, but always keep the future in mind. And that would probably be the heart of the way we structured it.
Yeah, and if I could just jump
Please,
in,
please.
I want to underscore something that that Cinnamon said and add to it a little bit. Like, we were very cognizant that leadership did not mean directors only or whatever. And so you'll see people in there from different levels of the organization, but also different vantage points of museums. We did a phenomenal couple of panel discussions with museum studies professors that talked about how they are cultivating inclusive leaders through their programs and what they're doing very intentionally. We had a interview with a person who works with a search firm and working with boards, looking for directors and what they are looking for, and how she is working to influence boards to put their decisions where their kind of their stated values are, right? And and really aligning kind of their practice with their talk or their rhetoric. And so some of these kind of different vantage points of the field were really interesting because it shows that there is a holistic approach to this change that we're hoping to see, and we're all doing pieces of it in different ways, which is really good to see.
I mean, I think what I saw you guys do was model inclusivity at a very beautiful level, because you not only had a diversity of people in the way that you're describing in terms of the different organization levels they represent right now, and also the different positionalities, but also even creating sort of this immersive practice where you're writing things and you're teaching people, reminding people that they must engage with the writing in some form or fashion. Like, we can't just write things just to regurgitate. We have to write things so that we can put them in practice, which is what I love mostly about the activities. And you know, you could have just ended it with one activity at the end, but you beautifully put an activity that coincided with each part and each theme. And I think that the sector is definitely going to be living off that for quite some time. It was beautifully done. Talk to me a little bit about when you asked us to represent our positionality at the beginning. Why was that important to you all?
I'll say a little bit about that. I think you're on mute there, Chris.
Do you want me to answer that, or do you want to answer?
You go for it then.
Well, you know, I think often editors get a lot of power and control, right? And you know, we could have really said, you know, Omar Eaton-Martínez, and list your position and your whatever, right? But I think for us, we were really thinking about what's really important about these authors. What has compelled us to really want to bring forth this group? And I think part of that was like, hey, we want you to represent yourself how you want to be represented. We don't get to call that. We don't get to name your identities. You know, and I think we wanted it to be something that, again, aligned with, you know, the values of the book and modeled kind of what we wanted to see. And so when we sent out the email about the table of contents, we identified our kind of identities that were important to us. And we said, you could do this if you want. Don't feel compelled. You can put what identities are important. You don't have to hit every dimension or realm. But how do you identify yourself? Because we want people to understand, as you're reading this book, who we are and what's important to us. And I think it's cool because you can pick up the book and you can look at the diversity of voices just by looking at the table of contents and how people are approaching this work. And I think that was pretty cool, how people really didn't push back, you know, and they sent back how they wanted to be identified, and they got to name that for themselves. And we didn't edit that at all, and we put that right into the book. So yeah, that's my take on it. I don't know if you want to add anything, Cinnamon.
Well, I would just add that I wanted also for folks who have really experienced a lot of pain at work and harm to be able to crack it open and say, okay, these folks are really talking to the people I need to hear this, right? They can have confidence in knowing that there's incredible diversity, there's incredible positionality coming together to make this book happen, and that they're seen. I wanted them to feel like there's something out there, and it's obvious and it's clear. I mean, I know I've looked through tables of contents and I can't possibly know all authors for sure, but I certainly can't know their identities or what their lenses are. And to just put that right out there just takes that off the table. Okay, we're serious. Let's move forward. And I'll just echo again what Chris said. It was a real relief to know that everybody was with us on this. Let's just do it and move forward. And it was fun, you know, because you have all these processes when you turn in your writing, like you sign off on documents and you have to talk about images and all these little technical things. And right there, check box, just in the same way they submitted their positionality without question. And that was a huge relief and a gift.
No, it's a great model of transparency and context, right? Because for me, as a scholar, when I'm reading someone, especially reading someone new, like I want to know all those things. I want to know all those things because it helps me begin to understand. Not to say that if I find out that somebody is a transgender woman of color, that I know everything about them. It's because I know that, but it gives me some level of framing to then launch into what I'm about to read that person put out. And I think it's really important for us to be able to do that and provide some consistency, and also to tell people why we do it, right? Because I think that's part of some of the pushback people are having now in terms of pronouns and things like that. Like, why is that important? And I think some people were doing it, even the people that were complicit in sharing their pronouns on their signature and their email, could not really tell you why they're doing it, except for they think that like it's supporting somebody, which for some people is enough, but I think it's better and more sustainable if you understand the context of why you're doing something, right? So that you can really continue not just to do it, but to teach other people why you're doing it. So I thought that was great. So for this portion, I want to kind of focus on, because after all this editing, all these things that you did, you all had the audacity to write your own chapters. I mean, as if you had enough things to do. So I wanted to focus on your chapters right now. And so Cinnamon, you wrote chapter 2, the 3 body problems of museums, which quickly are the problematic history of museums, the disproportionate amount of white people that make up museums, which impacts staff and audience demographics, and thirdly, the nature of museum leadership, which are like the power dynamics of traditional organizational structures that seem to mimic, in my mind, corporate structures, and how that's a problem. And quite frankly, I do notice that in museums, but we've had this conversation a lot in the Association of African American Museums. I see it a lot in our Black museums and culturally specific museums as well. We're starting to ask better questions why. And so you posed a question in that chapter, and I'd like for you to dig into it a little bit more concerning how current leaders are integrating or not integrating the current frameworks that they learned, right? So we have all this great work, as you all have shown through all these great authors and thought leaders, but some people are choosing to integrate and some people are not, or maybe halfway doing it. So my question is, do you believe the current field has the will, maybe the moral will to be more specific, to begin using the well-designed and expertly researched maps or tools and strategies? And I know the map thing was a shout out to Dr. Portia Moore's cartography article that she wrote in the Inclusam, which was an amazing article for those who haven't read it.
That's a great question. I've been thinking a lot about this, even since I wrote this chapter. I've been thinking even more. And leadership through an inclusive lens or framework requires vulnerability. It really does. And it requires emotion to come into your practice. It requires a level of sensitivity that is truly foreign in the C-suite around how people will react, how people might need to make decisions differently based on the decisions you make. But at the end of the day, vulnerability is a really difficult practice. And leaders have typically not been hired because they're good at vulnerability. They present as folks who have it all together, unflappable, decisive, can do amazing things under pressure, and none of that is healthy, mentally, physically, and otherwise. It simply isn't. It's unsustainable, and as I moved from my last position into this position, I certainly had the opportunity at the Abbey to deepen my emotional core, for lack of a better word. We had gone through an incredible amount of training, an incredible amount of sharing, and I was laid bare. I was completely bare.
Mm.
And it led to even my decision-making process. Like, okay, I've done what I can do here. And folks know a lot about me, and perhaps they need to see someone else next as I move on, because they might not be able to work with me based on everything I've shared as a white person. I don't know. I'm always willing to take it to the next level, but I just knew the dynamic had shifted. I could feel it. But moving to this institution, I feel like I have a new skill set around vulnerability. But I had to go through the patience to get there, and I have to do it as a daily practice to be vulnerable. And unless you're asked to do it, forced to do it, held accountable to do it, you are not going to start moving in that frame of work. And the more separated leadership is from the rest of the institution, the more insulated, I think, the further away you get from those opportunities for change, personal change. And I'm also finding, in particular where I am now, it's a state entity. You know, we're part of state government here in Illinois, and we're doing a lot of training in state government around diversity and inclusion. And a lot of the rhetoric coming out of leadership above me is, you have to do this training, it's mandatory, you have to start implementing it, but you don't have to worry about it at home. You have to do it at work. That's what we're going to hold you accountable for. I'm having a real problem with that, because vulnerability requires that you consider the whole person. You can't go home and be a raging racist and then come back and think it's all good, 8:30 to 5, and make good decisions, right? You're carrying that with you. I understand why that language is coming through, because it's new for the state, but also we have bargaining units, so they're negotiating with all of these labor unions around these issues, and what can you make people do. So the language, I think, is getting thin around mandatory training. And so now I'm in this space trying to navigate that and navigate what I know for sure about becoming an anti-racist person, an anti-racist organization. It requires the personal journey, and all of those things come together as one. Fortunately, I think my colleagues get that. They're not changing hats as they come in and out the door. But I wonder how far we can take this as leaders if that becomes the pushback, because you can't force me to change my personal life to work in your place. And it might be the trap door that a lot of leaders take. So I think that's the best way I would characterize my answer, is that I'm very concerned about the practice of vulnerability being elusive, but also easy to avoid. And it will keep leaders from doing the work they must do to change their institutions.
Well, I mean, it's an incredible testimony again. I mean, I just think about, you know, I did a talk a few years ago about something similar, where people are afraid to bring their whole selves to work. And even sort of in putting that adjacent to the conversation we just had about positionality, usually people are taught to hide their positionality, especially if it's on the margins, because they're afraid the dominant culture won't accept them. And I say the opposite. I say that's an advantage. That's your tool to win. That's your tool to express empathy and express vulnerability in the way that you're describing. And I think it's great. I want you then to talk about, because for me, you made application of that same thought in your successor at the Abbey. I mean, can you talk a little bit about how that turned out and what was, I mean, it seems like there was some intention there. I'm assuming something here, but maybe you could help us out and let me know what happened.
You know, I really don't know too much about the search process when I left the Abbey, because I was pretty far gone by that point, by the time they started. But I know that there were internal conversations around the nature of leadership they needed with their new understanding of decolonization. When I had left the Abbey, the majority of the board were Native folks, Wabanaki folks, not all, but most were part of that mix as well. The staff had Native representation. There was a standing Native advisory council. So the conversation had completely shifted over 10 years based on who's sitting at the table in a really deliberate, purposeful way. So naturally, the way the search would go 10 years later compared to how the search was done when I was hired would be different. And so the title they came up with, and so well, I'll back up. When I was hired as the CEO. That was the title they had. And during my time, I had a promotion title to president and CEO to follow the models of what was in the local nonprofit community. Very big nonprofit community on the island I lived on off the coast of Maine. So it was in keeping with that. And we just hadn't turned to what it meant for leadership titles while I was there. We had a whole bunch of other things to work on around decolonization. So what was great is as that transition happened, it opened up the opportunity for them to rethink it. So it was, I think the title was Executive Director and Senior Partner to Wabanaki Nations. I think that was how it was framed. So it was a pretty long title, but it was a very deliberate title to say that this is a partnership leadership opportunity. And so they were able to fill that position with a Wabanaki person, a Passamaquoddy gentleman named Chris Newell. And it was a great start. Sadly, he just had to leave the institution about 2 years later for personal reasons, and the search has continued. So I'll be curious to see what they decide to do.
Okay.
But it was definitely an innovative title, one that we don't see. But it was a good reflection of where their intentions are and what their impact they were working toward.
Wow, that's incredible. I'm always thinking about succession planning and how that seems to be very foreign in our field, in our sector. One of the things, that I mean, there's a couple of things in the corporate structure I wouldn't mind stealing, not everything, but I mean, the succession planning part, I would love to have that a little bit more part of the culture in our institutions, just because it allows you to sustain relationships and build people up and have them be lifted up in the same organization. And what happens now is for people who are really thinking about, upward mobility or other things of that nature, they're forced, many times forced to look elsewhere, which isn't, to me, a bad thing. I mean, that's what I've done, and I don't think it's necessarily been a bad thing. But I mean, if I know that there's organizations that have the desire to keep people, especially when you talk about community-based, practice, and keep people who are from the community working there to rise them up in the same organization, but they can't because they don't really have the tools or the strategies to really put together a proper succession plan. So that's what sort of sparked the question along with your very great chapter. So thank you for that. Chris, you are up. I want to talk about your chapter. You wrote chapter 3, Creating the Just Leader, Inclusive Leadership and Organizational Justice. So there you talk about the importance of leaders being self-aware. And in that self-awareness comes a recognition of barriers. So for example, I think you talked a little bit about mental models and norms. You talked about the very common concept of unconscious bias, although I think people talk about unconscious bias, still don't know what it means. And changing the direction, the ability to address the deeper issues. So what I would like to know is, for me, and this is what I've dealt with throughout my career, and I think I've found tools to deal with this better, but I think it's still something I need to improve on. So I want you to help me. How would someone like me take that understanding and deal with something like imposter syndrome, for instance, and how does that factor into all this and what you wrote?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, first off. And, I think how I would start to answer that would be, imposter syndrome also comes from barriers and socialization and blind spots and all of these different things. And I think they just maybe work in the opposite direction, right? So if we're talking about you and what I know about you being a, person of color in the museum field, there are certain positions in which you don't see yourself because you don't see yourself. Meaning, you don't see the possibility oftentimes of achieving that level, or when you do, it feels uncomfortable because there aren't a lot of examples or other folks like you in those positions, right? And that self-awareness of, first of all, I deserve to be here, and I'm self-aware of all of the various reasons, whether that's skills and knowledge, what I know, how I'm able to lead, all of these different types of things, to the very fact that we need people with diverse identities in leadership positions to achieve what we need to achieve in museums, right? And so being self-aware of the fact that I should be here, being self-aware of the bias that works against us, right? And so, whether it's blind spots, whether it's these types of things, but we're always socialized to see norms that tend to oppress people like us, or people of color, or people who identify outside of dominant norms, whether that's gender norms, age norms, whatever, right? And I think, to see, to feel that, should I be here or shouldn't I be here, or these types of things. So that's some internalized ways that I think self-awareness works. I also think we have to be self-aware of the actions of others at our level that make us feel like we shouldn't be there, right? So when people question our decision-making process, or when people question when we want to elevate or emphasize equity where it hasn't been emphasized before, which means we have to change how we do things. And we might hear things like, well, we don't do it like that. Or, you're new in your position, or you're new at this level, so you'll learn those things, or you're still learning, or these types of comments that make us feel like we're not supposed to be there, right? And I think being hypersensitive to those and aware of those instances where other people's kind of socialized norms or other people's default actions are essentially telling us we don't belong, that's we have to see that for what it is and call it out when we see it, right? Well, what do you mean by that? Oh, I didn't mean it that way. Well, then what did you mean? Right? Like, let's have that conversation. Or these types of things. And so I think it works both from an internalized perspective of how I've been socialized to achieve what I can achieve, or what people who look like me are supposed to achieve. But then there's also this socialized, or this other, external kind of self-awareness where we need to check people around us with how they're treating us, or their expectations of what leadership looks like, or these types of things. And I would just posit that self-awareness is such a powerful tool. And we never fully know our blind spots, or fully know our strengths and our opportunities and our challenges. But when we develop that practice to continue to reflect and say, how did I show up in that situation? How did other people show up in that situation? If it went off the rails, where did it go off the rails? And what could I do differently next time? It's that constant learning process, right? And I talk about this when I talk about intercultural competence. I talk about this when I talk about anti-racism. I talk about this when I talk about leadership. That self-awareness piece and that reflection piece, it's just so powerful. So powerful.
Yeah, it's been a thing, really, to think about how you show up, right? I know you talk a lot about that in our conversations and in some of your writings, but I'm also thinking about, like, right now we're in this moment where there's a lot of institutions, many of them predominantly white institutions, who are now sort of, for the first time, some of them really considering hiring leaders of color. And I bring this up because, and shout out to Museum Hugh, Monica Montgomery and Stephanie Cunningham, because, 6 years ago, we were finding this imposter syndrome happening a lot, right? Because even back then, before this new racial moment we had last year, there were some institutions who were starting to lean in on some positions to hire people of color and not saying we can't find anybody, but really earnestly looking. And we would be making recommendations, and people would be like, I don't think I'm ready, or I don't know if I'm good enough. And we're just like, well, what's happening? Like, we finally got, like, these people were looking for us, and now we're saying we're not ready. And so then we started to do some leadership development and try to fill that gap as best as we could with Museum Hugh. And so it's just a really interesting thing about the imposter syndrome, but also how you're leading into self-awareness to kind of work through those problems. That's great. So I want to bring Cinnamon back to the conversation and talk about this chapter 4. I thought that was really well done. 2 change agents, 2 cups of coffee, and just 2 friends, 2 colleagues supporting one another in this fight. And I think a lot of this is self-awareness, is self-care, it's collegial support, and how we are able to continue to get better as a sector and ultimately as a country and as a world. So my question is, why was it so important for you to be transparent and model the way you 2 support one another through the sharing of your experiences?
Well, first, I want to give a shout out to Kaylee Bryant Greenwell, because she's the one who put the idea in my head that there should be a chapter like this. It felt so self-aggrandizing to have us interview each other. And she really called it out for me and said, people need to hear what your motivations are, and they're curious. They want to know what you bring to this and why you are the chosen people to do this book. And we kind of built from there. And it was interesting because we had questions for each other. We had developed some prompts, so we were prepared. And of course, the edited version is, it's more than half. I mean, it's far less the size of the actual interview. We had so much to say. And the real skill was to figure out how to create it in a readable context. But you're exactly right. We needed to model how this is done. We needed to model how we reveal ourselves to each other. And we needed to show the value of what a trusted accountability partner can do for you. I mean, Chris is so good at raising a mirror for me and helping me see things that I feel are really minuscule and not a big deal. And he has been so generous to always remind me that no, those things really matter. You need to keep putting energy on that. People need to hear from you on these issues. So that kind of back and forth is critical, I think, for leaders to have as well. It helps you push your vulnerability scale, if you will, to have someone see you so clearly and watch your career and vice versa. And feel like you can sit down and reveal everything. I know I was thoroughly unguarded in that interview, and you can't do that with just anybody. And I feel that the more I do that, though, the more I'm able to be unguarded and authentic and real and ask the questions that I need to ask of people and gather feedback that I need to gather. I'm really bad at asking for feedback. I talk about it a lot. It's one of my horrible traits. And having the ability to go back and forth with somebody on this really teaches you how to solicit feedback as well, those hidden outcomes. And then to have to read it. That's startling to have to read it. And then go ahead and put it in a book for everybody to read. It's an incredible exercise. So maybe other folks could learn from this by just finding an accountability partner who is willing to watch you through your career and question what you say and lift you up when you need to be lifted up And this, I think this chapter shows you the power of what that can do.
Beautiful. Thank you. Chris?
Yeah, I mean, so I want to echo all that, and I want to add a couple of points, but I want to just say, like, for me, having that, you know, Cinnamon and I have different identities. We come from different backgrounds. We've worked at different types of institutions. We've worked at different levels. You know, I've never been a director. I've never been the person in charge, right? And I think our conversations have always been treasured conversations because we have those differences, and we have this level of trust in our relationship where I know if there's any criticism, it's constructive criticism because Cinnamon's helping me get better. That's the intent, right? It's about how I receive it, right? But that trust in that relationship helps me receive it in a headspace where I know what the intent is and I can receive it in that way, right?
Yes.
And what I would say is that is in my opinion, I'll speak for myself, the most powerful learning environment for the work that we do in terms of being on our own journeys. When you can have relationships like that. Omar, we've had the same relationship, you know, over the years. And I think I've been fortunate to have a number of people who are like, look, why do you see it that way, right? Here's how I see it, and let's have some dialogue around that. And sometimes I stand pat. Other times I move and I evolve, right? But those conversations are always rich. And so I think that was one of the things, and you can almost look at that chapter as an activity in and of itself. Because when you have those relationships like that, and you can have those deep conversations, how did I show up? Your identities were showing, you know, and let me show you how, so that next time maybe that doesn't show up that way, right? So I would add that. The other thing that I would add is, you know, this also models so many conversations I've had at conferences or these types of things with people who are deep in this work. And they're people who are in the book. There are people who I was able to share space with at Mass Action and Museums and Race and these types of things. And for me, my learning journey, I can sit down, edit a book, I can write, you know, I can research all of these things. I think my most valuable learning space is those conversations with colleagues who have been in this work and have experiences they can share with me. And so it was another opportunity for me to learn, right? And so the power of dialogue, the power of experience, and the power of sharing is just, like, I can't underscore that enough. And so there's an activity in the book that's about like an inventory of your in-group, right? And if you're in-group, everybody looks like you, walks like you, sounds like you. You don't have those relationships in place to get the kind of learning that I've been fortunate to have from these dialogues and these spaces that I've been able to share. So that's intentional work to create those relationships so that you can benefit from those conversations.
I love it because really the intentionality is to be better, but also like just to feel safe, right? To feel safe that you're doing this, because sometimes we don't always feel safe in doing this work. Some certain situations can get pretty hectic depending on which institution and which city you're in and what moment that we inherit, you know, on social media and corporate media this time. And you know, for a lot of us, you know, especially when it comes to things like racial violence, it's a continuum. It's not in these moments. And so I think it's wonderful that you two, and certainly we have, and other people are able to get together to support each other, because this work is difficult, but it's necessary. So what I'd like to do now is have you chime in. This one last question before we end. It's sort of I guess it's more of a what's happening now type of question. And I think it was referenced more than once throughout the book in different chapters, but I've been very intrigued with the whole Change the Museum Instagram. And so I wanted to know what you guys think about that. Is this a good thing for the field? If so, why? If it's a bad thing, or if you have some questions about it, what are those? Because I know that I've been hearing different things from different people. You guys are obviously very respected people in the field, so I'd like to hear you guys chime in on it.
Well, I have a lot of thoughts about Change the Museum. And first off, it's a tool for me. I'm not gonna lie. I read it and hold my breath and pray that my name doesn't show up. Second, it's a way for me to see patterns of behavior that's being called out for me to watch for myself. So it's got utility for my own self-awareness. I don't, you don't want to assume you're ever going to show up on this thing, but you just don't know how you're going to be interpreted or how things are going to land. And for that reason too, it's very risky for this Insta to exist, because museums are really chronically under-resourced, chronically under fire to have all that they need to survive and thrive. So this kind of public demonstration of the rotten core is risky. And so I watch it regularly. I watch it for patterns, but I also share it as an instrument for people to know that this change is real that's being asked of us. And if you don't get busy, they're coming for you. I mean, maybe that is what we need, is that fire lit for instructional change. I do a lot of presentations, and I used to show images of museum protests at the end. And what that looks like. Nobody wants to come to work and see your museum under protest. And of course, that is equally a scary situation to find yourself in when you thought you were leading in a certain direction that was widely acceptable, and suddenly you're being protested. Nobody wants that, but it can happen. And now I share more from Change the Museum because it's more lasting, it's more accessible. And if you don't think you can show up on there, think again. And then what does it mean to show up there and not make a change? Which I've been investigating some of those on the fringes. Like, this showed up here. Did they make that change? Is one museum in particular that's closer in my region that I can keep checking on, and they aren't making the change. And I know what's happening to the staff as a result. The morale is down. All of these people are starting to leave. Like, what happens when you don't respond to it? It's scary, but I think with the change that's required, we have to get scared sometimes. So I don't know, it's not going away. I mean, social media is social media, believe it or not. That's your choice, but I'm definitely watching it as a teaching tool.
That's awesome. That's awesome to know. Chris?
Yeah, so I'm familiar with it. I haven't spent a lot of time on the site. I've looked at it a handful of times. What I can say is, a lot of that is because a lot of what I've seen on there is things that either I've experienced or I know are happening anyways, right? And I think it's interesting because I've heard, kind of criticism about the anonymity and, things of that nature. And I'm like, well, I've also seen people who have put their name on some of these things and stood up in their institution and said some of these things, and there was retaliation, or things got worse or whatever. And so, I think questioning the validity, because it's an anonymous space for people to call out things that they've experienced. I don't think there's any credibility to that. It's hard to know if everything on there is true or not, right? But but I just did my dissertation research on, how people of color experience white normativity in museums. I did 39 interviews, and I can tell you the themes that came out are very similar to the themes that you see on Change the Museum. Rampant daily racism, oppression of staff, exploitation of staff, imposter syndrome, which we talked about earlier, the expectation that you're speaking for your race, but when you're not speaking for your race, you're not taken seriously as a professional. All of these different types of things were themes that emerged in the research I did. And I did not look at Change the Museum at all for my research, right? But you can see similarities. And so at what point do we say where there's smoke, there's fire, right? And we just start to say, that hurts, but I'm not going to question the validity of this because I don't want to believe that is the experience for certain people in museums. When do we just say, you know what, I'm going to put my trust in the fact that that's what that person experienced, that is their reality, and I as a leader have the power and the influence to do something about it. And that's what I'm going to focus on, rather than focus my energies on, well, that didn't happen, or that's not how our museum is, or these types of things. So, and I'm speaking more of a general kind of pushback or resistance to this stuff, not just necessarily resistance towards Change the Museum, but we've seen it 100 times where I'm not going to focus on what I can do to make change. I'm going to focus on invalidating the claims of people who are bringing this to light. And it's just a misguided focus in my mind, right? So I think when we can make that switch to, that's not what I want to hear, and I don't even need to know if that's true or not. That person's perception is their reality, and I'm going to change that reality. And I'm going to make sure that we're creating these inclusive spaces where we have equitable outcomes, and we understand that different identities shape people's experience every day when they walk in this museum, and they may be at their best, they may not, or all these different types of things, right? So I think that's how I would answer that question. I think we need space for people to feel comfortable sharing their stories. And if museums are not going to allow for that space, we're going to see things like Change the Museum, or, visitors of color, the Tumblr that Portia and Nikhil did, things like that, right? We're going to see that. And that's just the outlet that people will create.
That's great. Thank you both for that. It's definitely been something that's been on my mind. I've had many a conversation about Change the Museum, but I think I liken it to when we talk about victims of trauma, whether it's something like rape or racial violence, and then we do this victim blaming thing. And what is that about? Where does that come from? Where's the root of that? Certainly we can't validate every last claim that's on there, but I think it's safer to assume truth than it is to be dismissive of it, right? Because I think about the harm that it causes, or potentially could cause to someone if I were dismissive of it. But how would I hurt the person the other way? I always talk about power dynamics, where we talk about well rich people and poor people. Well, if a rich person is discriminatory towards a poor person, that discrimination could severely impact that poor person's life. Now, if a poor person is just being prejudiced against a rich person, I'm not exactly sure, outside of hurt feelings, what would happen to that rich person. And so I kind of try to view those things that way. But it's very hard with the anonymity, right? Because we're talking about being transparent all the time, but then because of this exact power dynamic, people they set up this platform so that people can speak their truth without having to worry about retaliation and rebuke. And we know that it does happen in this sector and just in this world in general. So thank you both for that. Well, Dr. Taylor and Cinnamon Catlin-Legutko, the book was incredible. It was an incredible feat. Add this one to the books. This is great. As I shared with Cinnamon when we were at ASLH, Chris, which we missed you there over there in Little Rock. But I told him, I said, I bought this book for our entire staff. I bought many copies. So I encourage everybody to do the same for their staff. I think it's a great resource. And I think it's something that people are going to intellectually eat off of for many years to come. So thank you very much for your work. Cinnamon, you're my sister in the struggle. I love and respect you, and I thank you for your time. Frat, you know how we do it, all day and every day. All day and every day.
Yes, sir.
I love y'all, and I thank you, and that's a wrap for the Museum JEDI Show. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks again for tuning into the show. The great Dr. Cornel West said, social justice is what love looks like in public. In light of this quote, and as we continue to consider museums as sites for social action and places of inclusion and belonging, our first question as museum folks should be, where's the love? And more specifically, where's the love that will allow us to see the humanity in one another? Until next time.